Hello ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar where we're looking at the 4 areas to get right when moving to invoice nirvana. So I extend to you a very warm welcome indeed. My name is Susie West and I am the founder and CEO at sharedserviceslink.com, and I'm very, very pleased to be presenting as our main speaker today, James Silcock, who's the VP Business Development EMEA at BancTec. And this webinar is brought to you by sharedserviceslink.com and sponsored by BancTec. So you do have a role to play in this, so please do bear that in mind. Please make sure that you post your questions to me throughout the 60 minutes, and I will be putting them to James in the last 10 minutes of this webinar. So please make sure you really do trawl your mind to think about all the reasons as to why you have signed up to this webinar today, and make sure that you post your questions to me as we go through the webinar, and I will ask them on your behalf to James in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So let's just have a little bit of context setting here and talk about why we're having this discussion today. So I think many shared services organisations are in a very similar situation today, which is they are being tasked with expansion. And we did a survey recently, and the results told us that 69% of recipients, and there were well over 100 recipients, were growing their shared services organisation, be that they were taking on more countries, they were expanding into other functions, or they were taking on more processes within the function that they had historically served. But the nature of the response was that there is a serious intention for growth. And interestingly, and I think you'll all concur, is that in order to expand, you need to make your model, your operating model, scalable. And for that to happen, the process flows and the transactions that flow across that process really do need to be as clean and as elegant and as automated as possible, so that the controls, the control around that is as robust as possible, and the process is robust as possible to support expansion. However, there is a problem, and many of us are very aware of this, but I think if we just align ourselves as to what that problem is, the problem when we look at the invoice is it does straddle 2 functions. It straddles the procurement function and it straddles the accounts payable function, but also let's remember, if you have a look at this orange box, it also straddles 2 companies, your own company and your supplier company. So it's not only a multi-stepped process, it's also a cross-functional process, and it's also a cross-enterprise process. And if you think about this, this process flow is followed day in, day out, hundreds of thousands of times each year, and these hundreds of thousands of transactions that begin life ideally with a PO or some kind of legitimate purchase that follows the process rules at the front end and then turns into an invoice at the other end. There are hundreds of thousands of these trading transactions that happen within our organisations each year that straddle departments and straddle enterprises. And then if we layer on top of that the complexity of our supplier bases, most of us have very, very complex supplier bases with not just a few hundred suppliers. The companies that run shared services organisations typically have supplier bases that are between 2,000 and 250,000 in number. And these are various suppliers with various technological capabilities and various relationships with you. So expecting them as well to comply with a particular invoice process procedure in the way that you would like them to comply is a big ask. So this is a particular problem, which means really that if we go to number 3, with hundreds of thousands of transactions and tens of thousands of suppliers, there is huge scope for variation of process, lack of process compliance in multiple touch points, which means human error and human intervention within those touch points, and therefore opportunities for error, potentially poor quality of data, the timeliness of that data coming into your system is not necessarily conducive to you being able to do accurate forecasting or accurate reporting. And because a lot of spend isn't captured properly up front, there's also patchy forecasting data, or at the very least incomplete forecasting data. And because of the timeliness of the data that's often dropped out the bottom of such a process, it also means that there's little credibility in the data that's provided because it's simply not timely and it's got holes in it. And this results in a high cost per transaction. But it doesn't need to be like this. And I do want to stress that this is a session that's looking at really getting towards invoice nirvana. So by following certain best practices, and we're certainly going to be looking at the areas that you can follow as best practice in order to move to invoice nirvana, you can certainly move to a touchless process, and that's when life becomes incredibly exciting. And I think it's good just to see, this also looks like a multi-step process, but interestingly, if you look at what I'm anticipating your department to reflect, or your function to reflect, which is the green boxes, you've actually shrunk down your touch points from however many there were in the first slide. I think there were probably about 15 or so, and they were manual, to we've got 4 here in this particular slide. But if you think about it, these touch points here are potentially electronic and touchless. So that means there are touch points in the organization. You can see in the blue box or the orange box for your supplier, maybe the purple box where your goods were checked in. But as far as the accounts payable function is concerned, and that's the function that largely sits in shared services, we're talking about 4 steps, and they are touchless. So just before I hand over to James, I just want you to ask yourself what life would look like in this nirvana, and what that would allow for your shared services to do in terms of becoming much more scalable, going for expansion, and really moving to a very exciting phase of accounts payable, which is much more about analytics of the data, and focusing much more on business intelligence and focusing much more on decision support. So I'll just leave you with that thought for a moment. And as you do that, I would like to introduce James Silcock, who's the VP Business Development EMEA at BancTec. Over to you, please, James.
Thank you very much, Susie. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to take this opportunity in this webinar to really sort of highlight the 4 areas that we believe are needed to get in order to achieve this invoice nirvana. Before I start, I'd like quickly to go through the areas that I'll be covering in the webinar. First of all, looking at the challenges that we believe our CFOs are facing in order to create a world-class finance operation. And then I'll go through each of the 4 areas which companies need to focus on. I want to go through, before we finish off, a little bit about BancTec and who we are, and then finally finish off with some key takeaways from this session. So before I do this, I'd like to hand over quickly to Susie for the first quick poll.
Thank you very much indeed, James. So let's have a look coming up on your screen now, please, ladies and gentlemen. How many invoices do you process annually? Is it less than 50,000, 50 to 150,000, 150 to 300,000, 300 to 800,000, or are you one of the larger shared services organizations processing 800,000 or more invoices per annum? We like to get the results up to about 70% of you responding, please. We're currently at 55%, so if you haven't already ticked the box representing your own invoice volume, so this is accounts payable purchase invoices coming in to your shared services organization each year. Less than 50,000, 50 to 150,000, 150 to 300,000, 300 to 800,000, or in excess of 800,000 per annum. We are at 64% of you responding. If you haven't already done so, please do tick the appropriate box. Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results. Quite interestingly, when we put these polls together, and especially these kinds of polls, I do anticipate a bell curve, but quite interestingly, we've got just shy of a third of you with very high volumes of invoices coming in, and really a very, very small percentage with less than 50,000 invoices per annum. Back to you, James.
Thank you, Susie. In this current economic climate, what we're seeing is CFOs have been tasked with deriving greater results from fewer and fewer resources. But at the same time, they must still maintain the compliance and also meet the increasing regulations that are coming through from the different government bodies. Over time, BancTec, we've helped a number of companies sort of optimize their finance and accounting processes, and we've been able to minimize the back office delays that can lead to missed opportunities, especially around areas such as early payment discounts. Most chief financial officers that we speak to really share a common goal. And that goal is both simple and very profound, and that is really to create a world-class finance organization. And CFOs, what we're seeing is, are seeking to build and manage a finance function that is both efficient and effective. But that has to keep the process rigor and control of costs in line, while at the same time ensuring that their business achieves the maximum shareholder value. It is an admirable task, yet a difficult one. And there are the challenges. And the challenges that we see sort of really lie into four key areas. First of all, you have the costs, the high operating costs from a fixed staff infrastructure. It's rigid. There's no adjustment to be able to balance and flex your workforce against the current volumes of business that you're coming through. And then there's the process and services. And what we've seen from multiple research, such as PayStream in the US, is that over 75% of companies are still keying invoices manually, and there's a low-level automation. And really, the services that are being offered at the moment can no longer be called state-of-art. And this then leads on to the risk of how they meet the specified SLAs and the problems when they migrate. They do want to migrate the technology platform and ensuring they still maintain the compliance and other requirements required. And when they come to innovation, this is a secondary process, and really continuous innovation is not really represented in this area. And to overcome these challenges, really, one of the ways that companies are looking to do is to make sure they have the right outsource partner accessing the latest innovation around the P2P process. And this will enable the CFOs to achieve this goal of world-class finance organization really through use of a sort of transformational innovation partnership between the CFO and the partner. And what you can see from this, that companies can align and focus their approved procurement processes and reduce the processing costs, and meet the SLAs. Now, if we dig down further into the the purchase to pay and look at the 6 key areas, this is from Nelson Hall, who did a survey in Europe. And the key things that they came up, really sort of feeding back onto the last slide, was that the speed of access to management information and the ability to meet the day sales outstanding, the DSO targets, is still a major area of dissatisfaction within these F&A departments. And at the same time, there remains considerable scope for F&A process improvement, with consistency of process across geographies remaining pretty modest, and the levels of manual intervention required excessive. And the manual intervention is really sort of on the sort of day-to-day transactional process to match and allocate payments. And the diversity of accounting systems that financial departments have to deal with these days is often causing even further excessive manual intervention in the preparation of the consolidated accounts. So organizations are still really seeking to improve the process efficiency of the F&A shared service centers, and they're putting greater pressure on really the transactional process of order to cash and purchase to pay, rather than on the management accounting. So looking at really sort of focusing on to the actual transactional basis. So we look at the business challenges and really going to the challenge to nirvana. What we see is, as I said, it's a proliferation of the ERP systems, the sophisticated accounting systems, And because this process is mainly manual and so intensive, what you see is that over 7% of invoices are lost. The number of incoming calls is basically 75% are basically asking about the status of their invoice, of which 80% of that 75% is really coming from internal buyers within the organization being chased by their suppliers to find out when payment is due. And the result of this is basically around 25% of invoices are now paid late. And what we can't forget is because of the rise of email and PDF going to the buyers as well as to the actual AP department, is that you end up with a number of duplicate invoices. But if you actually look over the spectrum, you are seeing that the actual processing costs and elapsed time for processing invoices does vary very widely. At the top, best in class, which is basically the top 20%, you're looking at roughly a cost of around £1.33 and time to take a process around 2.8 days. Now, if you then go to the other part of the spectrum, which is what we call, let's say, the laggards, the cost escalates up to £20, just under £21 to process an invoice. And the length of time it's taking, 35 days. Bear in mind that a lot of contracts have 30 days payable. So straight away they're into sort of late payments. Now, the average is sort of around 50.8 and under £6. But when you compare the different types of organizations, from the best to the laggards, you can see that over 80% of the companies are anywhere between 7 to 15 times as long to process an invoice when compared to the best in class. And this sort of additional time relates back into the amount of cost that they're incurring to process the transaction. So if we just break down that opportunity a little bit further, and we take a look at really some focus on the receipt of the invoice to the payment, we can see where the potential areas of inefficiencies really occur. On average, invoices are touched a minimum of 5 times before they are processed. And then when you actually, because the system tends to be manual, we have seen that some of our customers, with the result of inefficient manual processes, have resulted in the highest ever number of AP staff employed, but not with the efficiencies they've gone at. In fact, their overall processing times has been significantly sort of extended out because of the length of people they have. And because of these two, what we're seeing is companies are missing the opportunity for missed discounts, early payment discounts on the annual spend, and being able to actually segment their supplier base so they can come up with a proper procurement strategy for their supplier base. And when we look at lost invoices, because 7% are lost, and that's really down to manual process and the lack of defined processes companies experience. You end up with lost invoice or even worse, duplicate payments, as that lost invoice suddenly appears later on after the actual initial one has been paid. And because there's no real way to actually sort of utilize the metrics for the root cause analysis, you can't really get a hold of what's actually going on in the business. And that end result being is that there is no visibility of the entire process. And the additional staff are required to handle the increased calls from suppliers coming to check their payments, or in turn it could be your own staff within your organization coming checking up to find out when a payment is due for one of their suppliers' invoices. So if we actually look at the business value, there are sort of two really areas where you can have. One is direct cost, the impact, and the other one is based around the business impact. So if we look at the sort of direct cost impact, here we look at things like cost reduction. And through partnership with a transformational BPO company, we can look at anywhere between 30 to 40% operational savings purely through labor arbitrage and transforming the process, matching the workforce to the actual workload on a flexible basis. And because you've got the partnership in place, you can have access to the global labor pools that's available through your partner. They'll also supply you the latest technology and provide the industry best practices. with a benefit or without any significant upfront investment, which leads on to the high ROI of the actual process, because you don't have that high upfront investment, but you have a significant cost benefit by actually implementing such a solution. And then when we look at the business impact, on the working capital, improved compliance and process visibility, it really helps you to realize those lost profits. And you're able to offer more early discounts and avoid the late payment charges. It also frees up people to focus on the core business, make them more suitable to actually tackle the core business issues that's going on. It also enables you to move from a payable staff into more of a procurement staff, enable them to actually manage the procurement process closer and tighter, and help you to move your operation onto a more sort of founding around creating an actual profit center. And because you've got this orientation, what you're talking about is flexibility. And as I said, what we're looking at from CFO when we talk to them is what they really want to do is be able to actually move from a transactional-based service as in a cost center, and be able to really reposition itself as a profit center by looking at the monetization of its working capital through the use of managing different discounts to different segments of its actual supplier base. So let's start looking at the first nirvana we looked at. And the first one is really e-invoicing. So this is where I'll hand over to Susie for the second question, or the second poll.
Thank you very much indeed, James. So coming up on your screen now, where are you in your electronic invoicing maturity today? Maybe you're 100% paper. You're 100% paper, but very soon to be moving to or implementing electronic invoicing. You're mainly paper with part electronic. You're mainly electronic and part paper, or perhaps you are what we would call world class and maybe entirely or almost entirely electronic, i.e. over 85% electronic. And just to be clear on definition, I know James is going to touch on this later, when we talk about electronic, we're not talking about email PDFs. We're talking about receiving invoices from your supplier into your environment as a pure electronic file. Paper has never been printed on. So again, we like to get 70%, so if you haven't responded, please do so. And I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. So 69% of you responding there. So let's have a look at the results coming up on your screen now. So none of you are almost entirely electronic, i.e. over 85%. Interestingly, the ones who are 100% paper aren't moving imminently to implement electronic. And I think this is very representative of where the market is at 75% of you saying that you're mainly paper and part electronic, which I'm sure those are moving categories, with your electronic increasing and your paper decreasing. So interesting results. Back to you, please, James.
Thank you, Susie. One of the sort of invoicing sort of market research companies and analysts that we look to very closely is Valentis, Bruno Cox. And from Bruno's latest reports, we can see that the uptake of e-invoicing is growing, especially with the Nordic regions having the biggest share of just over around 40%. I would actually say that the actual growth hasn't been particularly fast over the last 3 years, and that the main growth is really coming from the larger companies adopting e-invoicing and persuading their suppliers to adopt e-invoicing as well, rather than from the smaller businesses, which are really still lagging behind. They don't see the benefit, it's too costly, and they really are trying to understand why should they move to a system where they can just send a PDF or a mail in the post. And really, so the next couple of slides will demonstrate what this smaller business based on our own research and our experience. And we have an operation out in Sweden. So we went out to the Swedish market, and we just decided to target 500 businesses, which were equally split between large and SME. Large was based on size of employees, and we saw a marked difference between what we call the supplier view and the buyer's view. And what you can see, especially in the suppliers, and these tend to be the smaller companies that we focused on really, was that the level of e-invoicing was actually incredibly small at about 3%. And the level of paper was still very, very high, around 52%. When we refer to hybrid, the hybrid really is what was said earlier on, which is the biggest segment, is part electronic, as in a PDF, as well as with the paper coming through. Now, we don't, at BancTec, recognize that a PDF is an e-invoice. It is no different to us as a physical mailed invoice, as it still needs to go through the data extraction process before being received by the accounts department. And an invoice, as Susie said, is really a peer-to-peer with no requirement for any handling of data extraction from the original document. But what you can do see is that on the buyer side is that the hybrid is at 84%. Now, when we looked into this, because there's a huge sort of difference, really what it came down to is that the buyers were outsourcing their AP process, as in the capturing of all the invoices. So what they were actually receiving was an image or a PDF with an electronic file, hence the hybrid. But even so, they were only looking at 9%, which if you look back at sort of Bruno's research, slightly lower than the sort of 13%. It's more equivalent to the sort of 2010 level, which was sort of at 10%. So it isn't a huge growth into the invoicing. So what we then decided to do was, let's have a look further at what's happening. And what we are seeing is the growth of the PDF in the marketplace, but also what we're seeing is we decided to go to the actual data itself. And in Stockholm, we have an operation that basically handles our Nordic processing center and our key center for handling our AP across Europe. And we process around in the Nordic market around 7 million invoices, of which that equates to around over 100,000 suppliers. So we took the data over a 2-week period, and over that 2-week period, that data equivalent to around 49,000 suppliers who we analyzed their invoices. And from that, what we found out was that over half of the invoices that we received in that period of time, 730 suppliers provided that. So that was only 1.5% of the suppliers actually provided over half. The rest, which was basically the other 48,500, supplied it just under 50%. And that really sort of gives us the size of the problem. It goes back to the graph earlier on that Susie referred to, where you see the big tail off. And the real sort of challenge is that when we actually then looked at how many sort of suppliers, who sent in less than, for example, 2 invoices per week, 36,000, which equates to around 74% of the actual base sent in less than 2 invoices per week. And the challenge really is, how do you get those 36,000, as well as going up to the 48,000, how do you get those guys to actually go on to e-invoicing and get the benefits of e-invoicing? The larger guys, 1.5%, those guys that have been targeted, and they most probably would be on e-invoices, but the rest is where the real challenge is. And if I look at when we automate the actual accounts payable process, the way we look at doing it is that if you actually look at saying, okay, there are multiple access points. You've got, from suppliers, you've got e-invoices all the way down to sort of paper. Yes, some actually do send fax, and there are still the email with the PDF as well as the EDI. What you want to do is be able to actually receive that in one location and then be able to actually process that through the AP automation that gives you the actual metrics and the dashboard to understand exactly what's happening, and then be sent on to your ERP application. So what BancTec is doing is we actually slowly to release a new product called BancPay, and this basically enables companies to get to the first area of the first nirvana. And it allows the large organizations, so the VANs and the EDIs, to use electronic e-invoices. But as well, giving the smaller companies the opportunity to send their invoices either directly from the ERP systems through a virtual printer, using a portal to upload their invoices. And for the micro merchants, we've seen them wanting to actually, because they don't have an accounting system and they only send in one invoice a month to a supplier like their consultant, there's an actual portal that allows them to actually upload themselves and enter in the invoice details directly to the actual end user, to the buyer. And in order actually to help organizations get there, organizations such as BancTec can assist by, in the move, by taking a holistic approach into handling invoices, by allowing their companies to send their transactions in whatever format and converting them into the format, into electronic format, so they can be actually easily accessed by the buyer. So really, in summary, e-invoicing is key to the improvement of the efficiency of the AP process. It does bring in the additional benefits, that we mentioned earlier in the presentation, such as working capital management, to the early discount program. It gives a reduced cost for not just the buyer, but also to the supplier. And it also helps reducing that approval process and then reduces the risk of late payments. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Susie again for the third poll.
Thank you very much, James. So coming up on your screen now, let's have a look at your outsourcing situation. To what degree do you use outsourcing for your business processes today? We have outsourced multiple functions. We have outsourced multiple processes within one function. We have outsourced a single process within one function. We have outsourced partial activities, or perhaps you have not outsourced at all. So we're at 51% of you responding. If you haven't already responded, please do so. To what degree do you use outsourcing for your business processes today? We have outsourced multiple functions. We've outsourced multiple processes in one function. We've outsourced a single process within one function. We've outsourced partial activities, or perhaps you have not outsourced at all. We're at 63% of you responding, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results coming up on your screen now. So just under half of you have not outsourced at all, and then interestingly, around a third of you have outsourced partial activities, with only 14% of you having outsourced multiple functions, and then you can see the other results there, with 5% outsourcing multiple functions and multiple processes in one function, and then single process in one function. So interesting results. Back to you, please, James.
We now move on to really the second area to move into invoice nirvana. This is really the visibility from source to settlement. And this is where we see it to enable for buyers and the suppliers to have full visibility of stages from the AP process. Now, I believe that we should be going to the next question, Susie. Okay. Now, what we have in the business challenge we see here is the challenge really on this part is where the multiple data comes from. You see majority of systems come from, invoices come from disparate systems for capturing data, whereby it could be paper, that could be coming from the scanning bureau or for your own mailroom. Then there's the issue of the email PDF. Suppliers will send their invoices via PDF, and that can be to the business buyer or to the AP department. Now, straight away you've got an issue there because the AP department will not realize that the actual invoice has been sent already to the business buyer. The business buyer may have not moved forward that invoice on, and so therefore you have a risk of delayed invoices, risk of duplicates, and above all, where the risk does come in, is duplicate payments. And then the last one is they implement an e-invoice for another separate company. So now you've got 3, maybe even 4 sources, data sources coming in. And really what you really want is one input is enough. In order to get from source to settlement, you just want one source in order to get the single view of the data. So we go back to, for example, the automating accounts of the BancPay. What we see here is what this allows is basically the process improvement in a single sort of source to settlement. We're looking at the real-time data from the e-invoices by equally the actual transformation of that data from the paper or the PDF into the invoice and allowing to the push for e-invoicing. It increases the data validation and therefore by doing so improves the SLAs that the service centers have to give back to their customers. But above all, what it does do, it enables the suppliers on the left to have full visibility of the payment status. And that could be, doesn't have to be suppliers, it could be sort of departments or people within your own organization chasing your AP department to find the status of the actual invoice. And by doing so you can actually start looking at how you can improve supplier satisfaction. And because it moves into one source, you end up having uniformity in data, which basically means less judgment and less mistakes. And because you have a single view coming through it enables you to manage the fraud management, which I'll come to a little bit later on in the actual presentation. But what also it does, it enables the reduction of costs, and basically I mean by that is reducing FTEs. And you can have less payable staff, and you can actually focus more on the procurement personnel, implementing new programs such as an early discount program across different segments of the supplier base. But more importantly, especially for a shared service center and also international organization, is the ability to have a business organizational structure support. What I mean by that is that you should be able to have people with roles and responsibilities to be able to see their client's data all the way down the actual tree, the organizational tree. And that visibility has been really sort of able for them to view the source of settlement throughout the organization. And that doesn't matter if you're a shared service provider with multiple clients or to an international organization where you may have multiple offices throughout the world, but you're looking to streamline your A2P process. And by being able to set up individuals with their own relevant roles and responsibility, it allows companies to manage their AP process on a global basis to gain that important efficiency of scale. So when we actually look at the source of settlement or the visibility, there might be 3 sort of key areas. The single view of your data for you and your supplier, consolidating the data input sources and allowing your suppliers and customers visibility of this transaction payment status. Accessibility, being able to view your transactions by computer, tablet or smartphone, supporting your home worker or your executives on the move, which will reduce the loss for delayed processing of transactions and reducing loss of invoices, and queries can be dealt with far quickly and an SLA is met and late payments avoided. And lastly, it's got to be global. To derive real benefit from this, the process efficiency, you need to be able to process your transactions for the lowest cost by transforming your A department into a global operation with hubs in key areas. So when we move, so that's really sort of the source of settlement. If I now move on to the next invoice nirvana, which is really around fraud. And this area now is becoming far more prevalent. In the Sunday Times this week, we've seen it. It was reported that fraud is now soaring, especially in the business community. And the reported cost to the British economy, I apologize to anybody outside Britain who's on this webinar, but what it said about the British economy has doubled from 38 billion in 2011 to 73 billion in the year from March 2012. And in these economic climes, fraud becomes more and more prevalent. And in January 2013, the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau released a press release basically warning of 3 areas that's happening with businesses. First of all was that more and more companies are actually falling victim to invoice fraud. And the scale of this fraud is significant. You know, what you're looking at is businesses are potentially losing anywhere from 100,000, in some cases to over £1 million due to the fraudulent activities. And the problem is that the length of time it takes to react basically means it takes that the funds tend to be moved offshore and therefore impossible to recover. And how they do this, what's reported in, was interesting, because what they said in the challenges was basically they, first of all, they prevent invoices being intercepted by the fraudster. So therefore, what that was basically saying was the fraudster was actually intercepting invoices between the supplier and the buyer. And then the second part is where the fraudster developed its knowledge and was aware of existing relationships between the actual supplier and the buyer, and then put in fraudulent requests for bank details to be changed. And the last one really was what I found was fascinating was the reasons they could do this was due to the lack of contact between the customer and the supplier personnel. So out of that we said, okay, what would be the best methods to try and avoid fraud? Well, the first one would be obviously sort of supplier approval. You know, make sure that you have a proper onboarding supplier approval process so you know who you're dealing with. The second, you know, remove the paper. You know, if you've got electronic invoices going from peer to peer, the likelihood of them being intercepted is going to be a lot lower than if it was for PDF, you know, and as far as paper, even more so. Then you move on to sort of using a secure portal. You know your customer and you know your supplier. And if you've got any sort of potential issues or concerns, you should be able to block off your commercial partner until you've done your investigation, then decide to switch them back on again. So you're actually managing your supplier base. And because we've talked about source of settlement and allowing your supplier to look at the actual payments from source to settlement and the status of the payment, if the supplier is able to see the fact the matter is that an invoice has been paid and yet he hasn't received the funds for it, he can very quickly go back through a fast messaging through a portal itself to query where the payment is, and by doing so highlight the fact that a fraudulent activity has happened. And the last one, especially in Sweden, there are known sort of fraudulent lists of fraudulent companies. And with this list, we use those lists to actually monitor the onboarding through the registration process and to bring on, and match them against the actual fraudulent list. And by doing that, we can actually move any sort of matches to an exception file and deal accordingly. And this also takes me now on to the last part of nirvana, which is matching. And the real objective of matching is to match all invoices to get to the single point, which is straight-through processing, which enables companies to have far quicker, higher adoption rates across the systems of the organization, but also being able to, be able to be flexible enough to change and make sure that you can able to build out coding and routing logics on the fly in order to help and ensure that all your invoices go through straightforward processing. And we work very closely with a company called Palette, who basically is our provider of our sort of AP software, which gives us the ability for multidimensional cascade mentioning capability, enable us to match against sort of multiple elements of the invoice, be that PO, supplier contract, any reference details or coding reference on the combination. So if I look at a sort of typical sort of flow diagram of how this process would work, we call it Approval Plus. And, using this cascading match and routing technology, as I said, provided by our partner Palette, allows each invoice to be matched by the matching engine to determine which type of matching is required. Once we've evaluated the invoices, these can be pre-coded and routed automatically. So a PO can be matched on the header or the line item level. It can be a 2-, 3-, or 4-way matching. Then that can be done automatically. And the no PO invoices can also be matched automatically. And as I said before, the system allows for this multi-dimensional cascading matching that has the capability to match and automate all kinds of invoices, not just PO invoices. And this is done, as I said before, using one or the following. We identify the PO number, the contract, reference, contact, multiple information that's on the actual invoices. And that helps us to match an invoice to its appropriate workflow and also the account coding sort of proposals. Now, give an example of this is well, I can't unfortunately mention the actual customer, but we did a bit in a system, and here's a sort of typical case study that if you look at it, you'd recognize the majority of the situation. Increasing headcount in the AP department, loads of invoices coming through, not being able to be handled, the volumes ever increasing volumes of queries from suppliers, but also from your own staff coming through asking about what's happening to their supplier's invoice because their supplier is asking them, they've sent the invoice in, they haven't heard anything. And the end result, basically, when we were taking it, was a very, very frustrated CFO and a very, very big, huge set of unhappy suppliers. Now, what we basically did, we went through the AP process, we looked at it, we transformed their process, we worked with them on the sort of the capture side, we worked with them on the actual delivery of the AP, the matching side as well. And from what we were able to do, we were able to gain better control of their AP process. And by doing so, this really reduced the number of calls from their suppliers and reduced the length of time it took to actually process the invoices. But the key part about this was the end result, was they had far more happier suppliers, but also a lot less frustrated CFO. CFO was still frustrated, but that's for other reasons. But he was a lot less frustrated when it came to the actual sort of the AP situation. Now, I alluded earlier on in the actual presentation that BancTec is launching a new service very shortly. And really, so this is breaking news. And this is a new service that we're sending out. It's called BancPay. And basically, BancPay is a new cloud-based open B2B business network offering a full P2P service. And it targets the 4 key nirvana areas. Now, I'm not going to go into detail now because later on this year in April, I'll be doing another webinar which hopefully we have a customer talking about it as well. We'll be launching it there. But I'd just like to really sort of, with BancPay, it covers off the invoicing. It's a holistic management of transactions from e-invoice all the way through to web form, PDF, and paper. Has 4 sources of settlement. It's an easy registration process. Suppliers and customers can create a trading network and they can view their invoices they've sent and which ones they've actually received. And it supports multiple devices. It has full B2B network, so basically it's like you invite your own suppliers and customers to join, a bit like a LinkedIn type of process. And being able to manage it, you're able then to create your own folders for audit or key supplier or even fraud management. And because we've linked up with our friends with Pallet, it has 2 levels of approval, an easy approval for micro merchants, and then another system which is more complicated, which is around the AP system that comes from Pallet. And the service is aimed at really sort of the full business community, but certainly around the shared service centres where they've got very complex, multiple organisational structures, and they need something in order to have one view and one support. But that's really, so I'm not going to do much more onto BancPay at the present moment. We can hear more about it later in the year. That really sort of concludes sort of my presentation, but I'd just like to just spend a couple of slides introducing BancTec for those people who haven't heard it. BancTec, we've been around for 40 years. We have extensive experience in the financial transaction market. Our customers are, mainly around the financial services, around the banks. In Europe, our main areas that we work in, the 5 top banks are our customers. And really the company has a very long, in-depth experience, long-term in-depth experience in transformational business process outsourcing and developing critical enterprise applications in the high volume transaction and document market. Our footprint around the globe is, we have around over 21 centers across America and Europe, which are supported by our nearshore operations in Estonia, and as well as an offshore captive operation in India. And what this basic global infrastructure allows us to do is we're able to meet the requirements of international companies looking to transform, consolidate, and improve their financial and document processes. The way we like to do, BancTec offers security in a single source partner and their outsourcing partner. And to finally, just to get an understanding of our ethos is that because we're a technology provider, we create our own IP as well as we offer it as a BPO service. What we're able to do is we learn from our own sort of BPO operations. We feed that back into our technology and sell to our customers so they get the benefit of our experience. But equally, what we learn from our customers, with our global customers across the globe, is that we're able to feed that back into our products. So what we end up having is that we have best of breed products using our own products, which means we can really focus on that global delivery experience that every company is looking for. So let me finish with the sort of going through the 4 areas of takeaways. Well, the 4 areas, the first one is e-invoicing. Through the use of an FA-service organization such as BancTec, we can help migrate companies to a full e-invoice conversion and help you through that journey from paper PDF and to an e-invoicing. The other part of it is the source of settlement. Allowing people to access the customer and the supplier will help you to reduce your costs dramatically. And to do that, a cloud-based portal system such as BancPay will able to give total transparency of the transactions regardless of the source. And by using the two, the source of settlement and as well as the invoicing, it should help you to start the fraud prevention. You're never going to stop fraud, but it helps you to actually manage it and try to prevent it. And that also comes through having a very strong B2B network where you have the connections and be able to handle the exception files. And lastly, it's being able to get to the exceptions and using this cascading approach. But at the end of the day, there is really only one nirvana that the CFOs really want, and they come back to me, and so does procurement directors, and that is they want the straight-through processing. One click, and the invoice gets to other people without any manual intervention. And I think, if you follow these 4, you'll be able to get there. Thank you very much. I'll now hand back to Susie.
Thank you very much indeed, James. And just before we move to questions, I did shortcut James earlier on, so I'm just going to launch that final poll, which will be coming up on your screen now. I do ask you all to respond to that, please, just before we move to questions. So what level of visibility do you have of your source to settle or purchase to pay, you might call it, transactions? Most spend is captured, and we track transactions right the way through to payment. Most spend is captured, but we do not track transactions to payment. Most spend is not captured, and we do not track accounts payable transactions. Most spend is not captured, but we do indeed track the payment or the invoice side of it, or maybe other. So if you can just let us know what the visibility is on your source to settle or purchase to pay transactions, please. We're only at 35% of you responding, so if you haven't already done so, please do tick the appropriate box that's representative of your organisation, and if it's none of the above apply, then please do tick other so we can get to a good representation of you. We do like to get these figures up to about 70%, and only 45% of you have responded so far. So closing the poll shortly, please, in 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at the results coming up on the screen now. So you can see from that, actually, encouragingly, although we were at 45% of you responding, 47% of you said that most spend is captured, and you do track transactions at the payable side as well, so that's very encouraging indeed. Right, let's move through to questions. If you haven't already sent me your question, please do so, but we do have a couple of minutes before we finish on the hour. So one question for you, James, is, in your opinion, why has it been so challenging for organizations to move to electronic invoicing? What is it about e-invoicing that suppliers struggle with?
I think the struggle is more to do with the SME side of the market. They need to understand the benefits, and also it's got to be something that is cost efficient to them. For many sort of smaller SME, smaller suppliers, the cost for them to go to e-invoicing is sometimes a little bit, in their opinion, too prohibitive. And by having a system in place that allows them to sort of have quick access, maybe like on a subscription basis based on the volume, which is affordable, I think you'll start to see the level of e-invoices rise. The other part about it is what we see is, well, it's working now, what I need to change. So there's a bit of an education as well in the marketplace. You know, sort of, when it doesn't, the assumption is it doesn't cost them, when in fact it does cost them, and maybe they don't fully understand the cost of actually sending paper invoices.
Okay, I'm sure we'll find out later in the year when we look more at the BancPay solution how that is looking to address that. Meanwhile, a question about your clients. So you've got 1,800 clients that you service through your 25 outsourcing centres. Could you give us a bit more of a breakdown as to what industries they represent?
There are many industries. The main ones they do is, it depends on what geography, but the majority of them are in the financial services market and also the healthcare market. We do have a few government ones, but to be honest, our main markets are in the financial services sector.
Okay, thank you. And also a question regarding specifically Canada. Would you be able to name some clients that you have maybe in the Canadian market or indeed the North American market?
I will be able to, but if there's someone sending the details, I can send them to them.
Okay. You talked about fraud as one of the areas that needed addressing in order to move to invoice nirvana. Obviously, fraud is on the increase, specifically, well, in particular in Britain that we had data for in this session, but generally across Europe as well. Just explain a little bit how technology is helping to alleviate situations where there is fraud.
Well, the first part about it is if you look at the two ways that they actually fraud occurred. I mean, the first one was the interception of basically invoices, and then basically what happens is that the account details are washed, which is called, and then overlaid with the fraudulent company's account details. Now, by technology, if you actually move to an e-invoicing, you obviously remove the risk of your invoices being intercepted because it's a peer-to-peer and there are less people involved in the manual process. The other part about it is, if you go into, let's say, the B2B network, which we was talking about, because you actually have to agree and to sign up a supplier or even the customer, you then have all constant dialogue between them, and then that enables you to have the constant visibility of what's happening in your transactional process. And therefore, you'll be able to pick up the fraud earlier. You'll also be able to, on the registration process, there are lists, as I've mentioned, available of known companies that fall into the sort of the fraudulent area, where you can match, the technology can help you to match against them to prevent you from accepting invoices from those type of companies. You can never get totally away from fraud, but you can start putting in places, processes to avoid fraud.
Okay, James, I'm afraid we are out of time. So there were a couple of other questions, but I know that you will follow up with them after the webinar. So James, thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, make sure that you join us at our various conferences that we have coming up for you for leaders in shared services, and make sure that